Collaborators, honest competitors, or hostile rivals? The tech sectors of the US and China. I'm Tonya Hall, and joining me is Herve Lemahieu, Senior Fellow at the Lowy Institute. Welcome, Herve.
Thanks very much for having me.
What is the mission of the Lowy Institute, and what is your role there?
So the Lowy Institute is a think tank in Australia. We realized about 15 years ago that there was a need to think about our foreign policy. We're in a very special place in the world. We're far from everything, or so we thought for a large portion of our history. But with globalization and the fact that Asia is essentially in our backyard, we're having to think about the implications of the rise of China, whether the US will continue to be our biggest ally in the future, or whether it decides to retrench from Asia. So there are all sorts of security, technological, economic trends that we need to think about, and we need to think about how that affects Australia and how Australia can affect those trends in the world. So we've been around for 15 years. We look at security, economics, we look at Southeast Asia, East Asia, the Middle East, and I specifically look after a project called the Asia Power Index, where we undertake a comprehensive assessment of the national capabilities of Australia and 24 other countries in our region. So we go as far north as Russia, as far west as Pakistan, and as far into the Pacific as the United States and Australia.
How would you describe the state of the technology business between China and major Asian powers like the United States, Australia, Japan, and India? Are we collaborators or honest competitors, or are we hostile rivals?
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting question, and I think basically it's a bit of everything. But we do seem to be moving from a period after the fall of the Cold War, where we were talking about a positive sum, a globalization where it was a win-win for everyone involved, back to something that resembles competition and zero-sum politics between the largest players, that is the United States and China, and every other country in Asia, but really in globally is also involved in that game. So I think there are three big implications here. One is that I don't think the United States will be able to stem the rise of China. China will be a rival to the United States, at least in its own region in Asia Pacific. Secondly, I think that globalization will continue to involve the United States and China, even if they do less and less together. So we're talking about decoupling between the world's two largest economies in terms of technology, in terms of trade, in terms of investment, as a result of the geopolitical competition that seems to be reasserting itself. But thirdly, I think that leaves a really interesting role for all sorts of third actors, businesses, but smaller players and countries like Australia, because our biggest business partner, our biggest trade partner is China, but our biggest security partner historically has been the United States. So we're caught in a very difficult position between the US and China, and that's not unique to Australia. A lot of Asian countries are dependent on China economically for globalization, increasingly, but also need the United States to be in the region to preserve security and to really rely on an alliance network to keep the peace in our region. So that's the source of tension in terms of foreign policy, but obviously we have to look at how technological trends, military capability, cyber, all sorts of new capabilities that countries are acquiring affect the balance of power in our region.
The Lowy Institute published a study, your project, called the Asia Power Index. You mentioned that earlier. On what basis did you find that while the US remains preeminent power in Asia, it has become a net underachiever in 2019?
Yeah, that's right, and I think this is a worrying sign, because what we're doing essentially is looking at comprehensive national power. We're looking at the ability of the US to project its influence and its interests abroad, to pursue its objectives with allies. And what we find is that the United States remains the dominant player within the Asia Pacific, and that's actually a very unique position to be in, because it's not actually an Asian power, it's an external strategic player, but it remains the most powerful country in Asia. However, the power differential between China and the US has narrowed over the course of the last 2 years, and the US has underachieved. What does that mean? We think that the Trump administration's foreign policy has actually succeeded in accelerating the leveling between the US and China, because it's overly fixated on things like renegotiating trade agreements, not only with China, but with a number of its allies, on rebalancing trade flows. And these initiatives are not keeping pace with the rise of China as an economic soft power in our region. So that is a worrying sign, but it is reversible with clever policy. But it requires investing in partnerships, and that's what we're not seeing at the moment.
To what degree are the major Chinese tech companies independent operators or extensions of the government or military?
It's very blurry, and this is something that concerns us in Australia increasingly because, for example, we do a lot of collaboration with our universities. Chinese academics come here. There's a knowledge sharing ethos here. We think that we stand to benefit from this kind of exchange of knowledge, and certainly they do too. However, a lot of the technologies that we're developing here have potential dual use capability. That is to say, they have both civilian applications as well as military applications. And if you scratch the surface, you realize that to a great extent, a lot of these Chinese academics in Australia actually have ties, direct or indirect, with the People Liberations Army. And what we don't want to do is to help with the military modernization efforts or an arms race in Asia that would only aid China, because China is increasingly assertive. So these are things that we're having to balance in Australia. We do want an open climate, but we don't want that to be abused. And so this is something that we're actively having to deal with at this point.
In what technology areas is China the strongest compared to the United States or Japan? Are there any tech sectors where they are or are likely to take the innovation lead?
Yeah, so we have to look at where the strategic comparative advantages come from. And what we've seen in particular is that China has made huge inroads in terms of renewables in general, renewable generation of whether that's wind, solar, or hydro. And at present, China produces 3 times as much renewable energy annually than does the United States, and is the global leader on that front. Why is that important? I mean, it's important because climate change is important, and we have to tackle, decarbonization. But more importantly, or as importantly, strategically, it means that China has recognized that it is increasingly dependent on procuring energy from abroad. Fossil fuels involves going further and further afield, protecting strategically vulnerable energy transit routes. Think about how the US was dependent on the Middle East for a very long time. Well, that's exactly what's happening with China as its economy is growing. So they're thinking strategically about this, and they want to have more autonomy over how they procure their energy. They want to own their energy, so they're less beholden to any other trade partners. Now, at the moment, they've got this close relationship with Russia. It hasn't always been close, but Russia is a source of diversification in the way that China procures its fossil fuels, but it's really thinking in terms of long-term, it needs to adapt to renewables. In Australia, this is an area where we lag. We could be doing much more. We have an entire continent where it's largely sunny, we have wind, we have hydro, and yet we're not thinking strategically. We're one of the largest energy exporters globally. We are net exporters of coal, and yet we are the most dependent country in Asia on importing refined fuel. And that means we're very vulnerable to any disruptions in energy trade flows. For example, something that happens in South China Sea or off the coast of Iran, tankers get bombed. Well, suddenly we're hit very quickly. So we need to think about a national fuel reserve, but we also need to think about investing in renewables. I think the same goes for the US. There is a strategic impediment here to trying to get further, to leapfrogging on the renewables ladder. And it's not just about climate change, it is also about geopolitics. So that's one front. I mean, another area where China seems to be making huge inroads in terms of supercomputing. This is quite amazing as a statistic. China now has more than double, about 225 supercomputers. That is to say, it has 225 of the best supercomputers of the top 500 globally. And the US only has 109. Now, not only did China manage to have double, but it has only overtook the US about a year ago in terms of its ability to produce these supercomputers. So this is another area where we're seeing China really leapfrogging. And we have to ask ourselves that technology, can be a double-edged sword. It can be used for benign purposes, to further globalization, to increase the prosperity of not only Chinese citizens but globally. But it can also have military advantages. So these are all sorts of trends which we're having to think about. And there are things that we, as Western countries, should be doing more of, and we should be thinking strategically about these technologies.
How might the protests in Hong Kong affect the mainland Chinese tech sector?
Yeah, well, it's a big question. I mean, China is rising, but it faces its own set of problems, and this is why ultimately we're skeptical that China will be able to have undisputed primacy in Asia anytime soon. Firstly, it faces external challenges, so it has a number of disputes with its neighbors, unresolved boundary disputes, and interstate conflict legacies that go back decades with countries like India and Vietnam. But then internally, it faces huge problems as well. So there's civil unrest, as we've seen in Hong Kong, as we've seen in Tibet, as we've seen in Xinjiang. There's the centralizing force of the Communist Party coming up against increasing, I think, and legitimate grievances of the people. As China's economy starts to slow as well, the kind of devil's pact between the Communist Party and Chinese citizens, which was to say, look, I agree not to have any political rights. In exchange, we have economic growth rates of 10% annually. That is sort of disappearing. That social pact is disappearing because the economy is slowing. So people are increasingly more concerned about public goods, about healthcare, about political rights. And that affects city-states like Hong Kong, but it also affects other places as well. China is also an aging society, so its workforce is going to decline by 158 million people over the course of the next 30 years. That's absolutely drastic. That is going to cause political and social challenges for the Communist Party. It also means that in relative terms, it will no longer be the world's most populous country very soon. India will take over, and by the mid-century, by 2050, India will be 20% larger than is China. So there are huge challenges which Beijing is having to confront. And while it's ahead in terms of technology, we have to keep on board these kind of social and economic and demographic trends as well.
What advice would you offer to US tech executives and regulators about working with the Chinese or expanding into their country?
I think that life will become more difficult, or things will get worse before they get better. And fundamentally, this is not just a Trump administration fluctuation in bilateral ties. I think something profound has shifted here between the relationship between the US and China. And that will make life more difficult for businesses who have traditionally tapped into China as a source of cheap labor. Now, China's cheap labor is disappearing anyway, and China's climbing the value chain. So in any case, even without the politics, business would become more difficult. And there's a diversification of trade and supply chains away from China into places like Taiwan and Vietnam and Malaysia, because they represent better value propositions. So I think we're talking about the bifurcation of supply chains. I think that's a phenomenon that's going to continue for both political reasons as well as these social and economic reasons. And what we're talking about then is globalization that will be a bit more like two spheres of influence, as opposed to the kind of interconnected, interdependent world that we got used to in the 90s and 2000s. That's the big picture view. But the other, I think, micro view is, you've got to be more careful traveling to China. We've seen high-profile arrests, for example, in the case of Huawei in Canada. which has involved then retaliatory measures in China, where China has actually taken hostage Canadian diplomats, for example, and so it's not, I think basically the world of politics is colliding with the world of business, and it's going to be unpredictable. I think businesses can no longer be perhaps geopolitically naive in the way that they once were. They've got to really read up on these trends.
Herve Lemahieu, Senior Fellow at the Lowy Institute. If somebody wants to connect with you, Herve, how can they do that?
So you can reach me on Twitter. I'm at Herve Lemahieu, that's HerveLemahieu. Or you can search for the Asia Power Index or the Lowy Institute, and I'm very happy to continue the debate and the discussion on Twitter. Thanks very much.
Sounds good. Thanks again for joining us. And if you guys want to find more of my interviews, you can do that right here or go to tonyahall.net. Thanks for watching.